Hello, and welcome to another episode of Deep Think. I'm your host, Antoun Issa. Today, we're going to do something a bit different. For the last few weeks, I've been a bit busy launching my book, Rebirth, A Love Story from the Depths of War. This book is situated in the first few years of the Lebanese Civil War. They're my mum's stories of living on the front lines of really intense clashes. There was love, and then tragedy, and then lots of tragedy before my mother and my family ended up migrating to Australia. And so, as you can expect, when a new book is released, there's a bit of a circuit. There are interviews, there's podcasts, and there's one podcast interview that I had with the Readings bookstore that I thought was just absolutely brilliant, largely because we didn't just focus on the book, but we used the book as a springboard to talk about issues that are at the core of what we've been talking about here at Deep Think. The interview goes in so many different places. We talk about the history of Beirut. We talk about how war transforms cities and geographical spaces. We talk about how war lingers through trauma over generations long after the final bullets have been fired. We talk about how the resistance in the Arab world, and the Levant in particular, has endured over a century of Western imperialism. And I want to give my thanks to Readings for allowing us to republish this podcast episode, and I hope you find it as rewarding as I found it sitting there and being interviewed by the podcaster Nico. So, please enjoy.
Welcome to the Readings Podcast, a production from Melbourne's leading independent bookshop, Readings. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. On behalf of Readings, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of this land and pay earnest respects to elders past and present. In today's episode, a conversation with writer and journalist Antoun Issa, author of Rebirth, A Love Story from the Depths of War. Beirut, Lebanon, 1974. Layla Khalil has just come of age for marriage. The eldest of 5 in a poor Catholic family, Layla knows that she must fulfill her family's expectations. But her heart is drawn to the handsome Nicolas, a coiffeur at a local hair salon. Dodging the watchful eyes in their patriarchal society, particularly those of Layla's domineering father, the two young lovers begin a tender romance. Soon, they make plans for marriage. But Layla's dreams are dashed when the Lebanese Civil War breaks out. Shells whir overhead as Layla's family are caught in heavy clashes between rival militias of phalangists and those belonging to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. When tragedy strikes, Layla watches all her hopes wither to ash. But just as life seems at its darkest, a lifeline presents itself: the prospect of migration to a faraway land called Australia. Rebirth is the story of Antoun Issa's mother, of the home and family she left behind, and of her new life in Australia. I spoke with Issa, discussing what it was like to write this story, what he learned along the way, and what lessons could be learned in our current moment. I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, Antoun, thank you for joining me on the Readings Podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you here to discuss your book.
Thank you for having me, Nico.
I found this book so fascinating and touching. And I think this is because even though it's a story set mostly in the 1970s, and it speaks very much to a place and a time, I think there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from it in our current moment too. So to go back to the beginnings of this book, it's a very personal project. Obviously, you're telling your mother's story, a story of love, war, and migration. But I'd like to ask you what first compelled you to explore this story, and when did you decide that this was a story that you wanted to share with other people publicly?
Well, it's funny you said if I wanted to share it publicly, because I got the box last week of the first printed copies. And when I opened the box, my initial reaction, a subconscious reaction, was I just had a stomach churn, like a slight nausea. The first indication for me that had leapt off the screen leapt off out of a Word doc and into something physical, and not just physical, but everyone else could have their hands on. And the process of writing the story and researching and traveling, took several years. Getting those copies was like the first indication that it was no longer just a personal story, but it was out there in the world. So that was my initial reaction, but I've calmed down since. But in terms of how we got there, it was really a full circle kind of moment. And I go through this in the prologue. Being born into a family that, migrated, that was clearly like not part of the norm in the society we're living in, the community we're living in, especially in our community. We're living in the outer northern suburbs, which is still in the 80s and 90s in Melbourne, semi-rural, farmlands across. And so, they were predominantly very Anglo. Today they're not. There's, huge waves of migration. Those suburbs have ballooned ever since. But when we arrived, when we moved, there were very few of us. So we stood out like a sore thumb. So growing up in that environment, growing up with the hangover of the Lebanese Civil War, we kind of grew up in a household and a community that was still very charged by the Civil War. I guess nursing the wounds. Being in that kind of family, in that household, put me on a path towards actually want to dive a bit deeper into it. And so I became a journalist. My first journalism job full-time was in Beirut. I moved there in 2011 at the height of the Arab Spring. And, for the past 15 years, I had been bouncing from Beirut, and I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the foreign policy circle focusing on the Middle East in Washington during the first Trump term. Worked at a think tank in D.C., then I went to the Atlantic. I came back to Australia during COVID and joined The Guardian, and I was at The Guardian for several years. And then I left and started my own independent media called Deep Cut last year. My career had been in this space at a media level, at a political and policy level, especially in DC, but also even at a humanitarian level, because when you're a journalist on the field in these areas, you're not removed from the consequences of war. They're right in your face. And so that's what I experienced when I was in Lebanon for 3 years, when the Syrian civil war was raging next door and we had an influx of refugees into Lebanon. I kind of started to get a better understanding as to the context of my own story. And then by the end of the last decade, the end of the 2010s, I came back from the US for a trip to Australia. And, the dots started to connect a bit between what I had been working in for such a long time and our own story and our own journey. And so I revisited, I guess, what I grew up in. And that was dealing with our own war traumas. And I, sat Mum down. She revealed a few spicy details. And then I'm like, okay, we're going to dive into this. I mean, I knew of, the tragedies that had befallen the family, obviously as a child, but I had never heard them with such detail and precision. And yeah, Mum relived those details pretty excruciatingly for her. I mean, she had to relive a lot of the trauma and remember a lot of specific things that, she probably buried underneath of her own kind of traumatic wounds. That's pretty much the whole story. And we've just come back full circle and I've written this book. Yeah.
Look, no trouble in you detailing the story there yourself. I think it's a really nice basis from which to begin our conversation. But maybe to further ground our listeners in an understanding of what this book is about, but also where it takes place, I wanted to talk with you about Beirut. So it's a place of great significance and uniqueness in the Arab world. It's been referred to with all sorts of other names throughout recent history, be it the Paris of the Middle East or Arab Hanoi. But these are rather superficial labels that don't do justice to the cultural depth of what's a really ancient place. So maybe to cut through some of the cliches, I'd really love if you could speak to how you frame this city in the book, how you frame your understanding of the place on 3 important levels. So the history going back hundreds of years, your family's memories of more recent decades past, and your own time living there much more recently.
Right. It's a good starting point for this conversation because my heart breaks for Beirut and it's really touchy. Especially now with current context of, the wars that it's gone through. And I think what I kind of accessed through Mum was the Beirut that we can only imagine. Now we get into the epilogue. That we can only imagine as children of migrants, right? Children of migrants who have, again, had that kind of war past. Because what war does is, especially in a place, when we're talking about geographical space and a geographical place, is that it totally transforms that place. And the civil war was largely fought in Beirut. And so buildings were destroyed, neighborhoods were destroyed, populations were transferred from one neighborhood to another, and then on top of that, you get waves of migrants internally displaced going to the capital, obviously, because they're trying to find safety. The whole fabric of the society just completely transforms. The city transforms. The 19th century Beirut was really its heyday because as the Ottoman Empire was kind of declining and was known as the sick man of Europe, and in those days, Lebanon was part of the Ottoman Empire. It actually was a time when Beirut thrived economically, coincidentally, while the empire itself was kind of dragging down. Because Beirut had emerged as the primary city on the Levantine coast. And when we say Levant, it includes the entire coast from Antioch in the very north, which is currently under Turkey, but should be part of Syria, and all the way to Gaza in the south, right? So Palestine, Lebanon, there's no such thing. This is pre-colonial. We are all the same. We're all coastal people. We live on the same coast. And Beirut had emerged as the primary kind of economic financial hub in the 19th century, especially mid to late 19th century, and as being the port, the main principal port city for Damascus. It was the main city where trade was happening from the Syrian inland that was going out to Europe. It was a real gateway. And so it boomed financially, it boomed culturally, it boomed architecturally, ironically at a time when the Ottoman Empire itself was decaying. Fast forward to the 1970s or the mid-20th century, that is the landscape of Beirut. And that is also the landscape of the town that I talk about, Jisr al-Basha, where my mum grew up. That town came to being during this era of Beirut's economic boom. And I've got the history in the book. The Ottoman governor of Mount Lebanon at the time decided to build a bridge over the river to have better access from the city to the mountains, and also have another route going to Damascus because there's a lot of trade happening. And the town, Jisr al-Basha, which is the place where the book is situated, in English translates to the bridge of the Pasha. And Ottoman governors, what are they called? Pashas. So it was the bridge of the Pasha, bridge of the Ottoman Pasha. He built this bridge, this wonderful, beautiful 19th century bridge over the river. And next to it, he planted a garden, Pasha's garden. Beautiful Indian banyan tree that grew gigantic, that 100 years later, the trunk was so big they were having, small kind of theatres and plays in the trunk to an audience. It's such a beautiful kind of scenery that was set. And this was all of Beirut. So fast forward to, the 1950s, 60s, 70s when mum was growing up there, all those remnants were there. The remnants of like that Ottoman era, the remnants of Beirut's boom in the late 19th century. And then you had the overlay of French colonialism. And then you had the post-independence brutalist construction boom. Beirut in those days was a city that was kind of mixed. It was a city that was kind of growing, a city that was full of orchids. And I talk about that a lot in my book. So, mum grew up around orchids of citrus trees and, olive groves and loquat trees. And it's a beautiful scenic setting. There's a beautiful 19th century bridge, with the river and a garden and the church. It's so scenic and so picturesque and so beautiful. And the Beirut that I got to experience was none of that, which is why my heart breaks. And I think a lot of Lebanese people have their hearts broken. It's none of that. I was talking about that banyan tree. What's there right now is an office block on that banyan tree. The river is a polluted waste stream where just garbage just flows through. That 19th century bridge has crumbled and it's replaced by a horrible standard road with no aesthetic to it. Nothing has remained. Got destroyed during the Civil War and it got destroyed with the reconstruction because it was haphazard, it was chaotic, society was ruptured. We've had no real proper state in Lebanon since the Civil War. The Civil War technically ended in 1990, but we've lived in the Civil War era since 1975. It's been 50 years. The same leaders who fought those wars, those warlords, have been in power ever since. The rot hasn't stopped. It's continued. So when I got to Beirut, you scratch and you scratch to find the remnants of the Beirut that mum knew. When I was there researching the book, the glimpse that I got was it's overcrowded, it's polluted. The reconstruction has been just as damaging, if not more, than the actual Civil War itself. There's horrible apartment blocks, concrete blocks everywhere. I was there in March during spring. I'd walk down the streets and smell orange blossom. And you'd see sticking out of these concrete blocks and these roads trying to survive are these really, you can tell they're very old orange trees that are still giving fragrance to the city and are trying to still survive amidst that. Like the layers of Beirut are underneath the current mess. But we've lost the city. It's been lost. And I think a big part of my book is a profound love underneath to Beirut and also to Lebanon. A love of loss, I think.
I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it, even as it is painful in the way that you speak to it. And in there you touched on intergenerational storytelling and experience. And it's this idea of memory that forms so much of the narrative thread running throughout this book. But I understand that you've also conducted quite extensive research, both remotely and in person in Lebanon. So how did you go about navigating this balance between memory, research, experience when you were crafting this work?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was mum's memories, but I could never have written that book if I didn't have my experience of living there, which is why it was a full circle moment. I could never have written this book at the start of my career in the late 2000s. So living there for several years, living in Beirut for several years myself, and also developing a thing that's common amongst migrant children. You know, we hear about our ancestral lands through our parents and our grandparents. And often, you know, if we don't experience it ourselves, our relationships with our culture and our background and our countries is through them.
Yeah.
But what I happened to achieve by living there with 3 years was my own relationship with Beirut, independent of my parents and independent of mum. So I knew Beirut through my own eyes and my own experiences. And I think doing that enabled me then to kind of meet mum at a level when I got to interviewing her several years later in a way that I could understand, I guess, the places that she was talking about. So it was part memory, but it was memory that I could visualize and I could place. So that provided obviously infinite help in actually being able to write this story with the specificity that I did in this book. So it was partly that. After I interviewed mum, I went to Lebanon in 2024 for a month. DFAT had advisories not to go, but of course, you know, I still went. And that's because also I knew the country. I knew how to navigate a country during a war. Yeah, I did research essentially to kind of document and go through archives and essentially fact check my mum's story as well. You know, you're a journalist, you've got to do that kind of stuff. You can't just rely on testimony. It has to coincide with actual events that took place. So I went through newspaper archives when I was in Beirut. I interviewed historians to place, I guess, the incidents and the events that occurred in the book with my family alongside actual events that took place. And, you know, they married up. So when I wrote the first draft, the first manuscript, I intentionally didn't want it to be political and I kept the politics at a minimum. But my conversations in Lebanon and Beirut when I went to visit and do the research there was essentially to get the political specific details of what was happening around. You know, I'd look at, you know, the days in which things happened to my family. I would look at what the newspaper articles were saying on that day, what's taking place.
So in looking back on what was taking place day by day, as learned readers, we can look back in retrospect and see what was to come so clearly in all its horror. But the story that you write is very much from a close perspective, your mother's direct world in that time. And in that closeness, we get a strong sense of your mother's agency in her own life, as well as her sense of responsibility to her family. And that complexity of her inner life, which I appreciate in your framing of this story, your mother's life is also shot through with so much loss and pain. So, as someone so close to her, what was the experience like of writing your mother's story to share with the world? What was it really like?
It was terribly traumatic. I got book leave from The Guardian to do all this. So I did a month in Lebanon to research. Then I went to the French Pyrenees to write the first bit. And then I went to Umbria in Italy. And it was in Umbria that I think that I wrote the most powerful parts of the book. You know, I've been a journalist for a long time. And, you know, when you write journalism, it's very dry, it's very rigid. When you write something like this, you really have to transport yourself into the characters and the time and the space and live in that in your mind in order to truly do the story justice. And that's with, I think, any story. This happened to be my mum's story, which added another layer of intensity to it. And, you know, I was crying absolutely every day. There were so many aha moments, I think, in my own relationship with mum that was just flashing, picturing myself. Because I'm picturing myself in her shoes in those days and writing her character and, you know, being her eyes in my mind in that time. Our parents have lived a life before they've had us. It was my real attempt to actually get to know my mum before everything happened. So it was incredibly traumatic because I felt like for the first time I really understood the pain of everything she went through and how difficult and insane and incredibly challenging it would have been to make a decision to just migrate as a war was raging around you and you had suffered immensely. There's so much she left behind that I still can't kind of grapple with. You know, I'd been crying every day in Italy, writing these powerful moments, and then, you know, I'd get on the phone with mum, a video call, and she'd be like, "Can you just get over and stop crying and being depressed? It's done. It was ages ago. I've moved on." And then I'm like, "I know, but it's so bad." So, yeah, look, it's very tough. It's very tough to kind of walk in and place yourself and live the moments, I think, in your mind of trauma that's been inflicted to someone who's very close to you. I don't look at this with negativity. You know, I think we always associate this stuff with like, oh, it's traumatic, it's sad, poor you. No, it's none of that. It's something really enriching in someone's personal experience to be able to, I guess, really reach the depths of our emotional depth. You know, the deepest sentiments we can possibly feel is not one of euphoric love. It's often one of the sharpest, deepest pain. And that's not to say, you know, we should all be morbid in our lives. There's something beautiful about being able to touch this raw emotion and carrying that with you and the knowledge that it brings, the knowledge of life that it gives you. I don't think there's something that rivals that. I'm not masochistic. I'm not doing this to kind of inflict self-pain. It was more of a willingness to kind of like test the extent of my own human emotional senses and appreciate the beauty that comes out of it. Because I think pain and love, they're inseparable. They're on the one kind of strand. They're drawn from the same well. And I don't think you can really appreciate love in its euphoric sense if you don't understand love in its painful sense. They're the same. They're intertwined. This was an exercise in that, for sure.
I think that might be the most beautiful sentiment anyone's ever expressed on this podcast. But I definitely understand what you're saying. And I think that does come through because you yourself are not really present in this story. And I mean this only in a respectful manner because you're there in the prologue, the epilogue, and the acknowledgements, which I want to touch on later. But I think this doesn't feel like a piece of journalism or reportage, despite the research and the diligence in the approach. Despite your proximity, there's more of a dignified reverence. There's an intent here that I appreciate. I wanted to turn to how you approach the subject matter of the war that engulfs the lives of your mother and your extended family. So it doesn't arrive as an abstraction, as something happening over there. It arrives as something that is felt, often amidst the routine of life, of work, and your mother's own work as a young woman. Her professional craft is of great importance to her for a number of different reasons, as it would be for anybody. But this war reshapes the lives, the occupations, ambitions, and the dreams of everyone that it touches. This is different to how much of war is communicated outside of the context where it is happening. So often it's numbers, statistics, a really sheer reduction of humanity within these contexts. So do you have thoughts about approaching writing about war as experienced in a felt, familial way? And how would this differ from writing about it in more of a perhaps intentionally separated or a journalistic manner for all the shortcomings that the form sometimes necessitates?
Yeah. This comes down to the medium. And, you know, journalism is very, you know, it's short form, it's quick. And the mode of journalism is that there needs to be often a news hook. And a news hook needs to be catchy. And as obviously in the last 20 years, we've had, you know, the evolution of technology, digital technology at such a rapid pace that it's actually really transformed journalism, which was already rigid and short and crisp. You can only get a soundbite and you have to kind of bunch it in with all the political context so it makes sense to whoever's consuming it. That's been made even more condensed and more short within the last 15 or so years with the digital kind of revolution that we're all experiencing, where everything now is a soundbite. It's just impossible to get everything that you need to get into, to have something where you can connect to the people on the ground who are experiencing and even relay what they're actually experiencing. And now, obviously, I think the experience of the Gaza genocide the last few years and our mode of consuming it through often social media and videos, we're getting glimpses of the horror and the realities on the ground. And we're also getting glimpses of, the starvation that they went through and the suffering that they endured at a human level. But again, it's short form, posted and forgotten within, a few hours. Is an inundation, a daily inundation. Our attention span is reduced to a few seconds. And the algorithm is also geared. All this content is also dependent on an algorithm that wants to reward rage and not really reward the critical and in-depth stories that you can only get really through a book. And I practice all that, and I've practiced all that journalism. I do videos, I do short form, I do news, I do all that stuff. But I never look at those mediums as ways in which to convey the real context, the real in-depth reality of what living a war is like. And that's another lesson from my book. Wars aren't confined to the periods in which they occur. So I'm referring to a 1975 war. The whole story, my whole book is the fact that 50 years later, it has such profound effect on the people who experienced it and the generations that came after them. And that's one of the compelling messages that I'm trying to get out with this book. It's that every war that you see and the people who suffer those wars, it's not forgotten when there's a ceasefire or if there's a peace settlement. Those people who have endured and have suffered will suffer for the rest of their lives. It will be imprinted into the DNA of their children, that traumatic response. And their children will have to grow up with that trauma. We've been displaced. I'm grown up and living in Australia, talking to you in English. I'm not even talking Arabic because English is my first language. All this is a consequence of war. So it's not just something that can be isolated. And how do you capture that when you're a journalist? It's impossible to capture that because, your goal as a journalist is to capture the news cycle as it occurs. Journalism isn't there to kind of look at the consequences that linger on for decades and decades and transform societies and transform cities like Beirut. So it is a matter of medium. And so writing this book really was the only way, because this is the beauty of books. It offers you the ability to kind of capturing things like the transformation of Beirut over decades, capturing things like trauma and how it lingers within families long after they've experienced the tragedies of war. So in order to do that, you really need to have the medium that is available to you. And books, there was no real choice but to write this in this format, because it's the only format that allows it to do so. And that's why books are so valuable, because even though we live in this world where we think books are an outdated model because they've been around for centuries, people have been writing for thousands of years, it's still the most important form for the human conscience, because it's the only way in which we can capture and we can archive moments and throw them into the timeline of history. It's really the only way in which we can do that. I've done plenty of videos in the last several years talking about the Middle East, but they're forgotten a day later. So that's not the way we archive and tell our stories. This is how we tell our stories. And that's the power of books.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I agree not just as a bookseller who has a financial stake in inflating the form's importance, but I think there is a distinct need for the empiricism and the storytelling that cuts through more skewed or opportunistic narratives. And I think about this in the context of this particular conflict, where so much of the chronicling of the Lebanese Civil War is replete with discussions about sectarianism, about ethnicity, and it is a very sad truth that division along those lines shaped so much of the violence that occurred in the country in that period. A lot of people believe that there is a sole righteous combatant or ideology in this war, in almost the most perverse, horrifying form of following a sporting club, as if anything we do, no matter how depraved, is justified because we are the just ones. But what I find running throughout this book is an attempt by, and a philosophy inherent to your mother's being, to resist simplified narratives. And what I pick up from you as a chronicler is an intent to depict the conflict in a manner that also pushes against this. Am I right in thinking this?
So that was very intentional. I wanted to display and demonstrate the nuance that exists within the communities. So, we're a Christian background, mum's Maronite. They were fighting Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in the camps that were, near the neighborhood at the time. I think from the outside, when people write about Lebanon, as you said, they write it as if they're kind of like essentializing that all these communities are homogenous. All the Christians are on this page, and all the Shiite Muslims support Hezbollah, and all the Sunnis are on that page. And it's not that. Within these households, within these families, there are discussions, there are debates, there is pushback. And, there's several scenes where mum is pretty strong-minded and argues with her own family, because where she's coming from is, I'm suffering the consequences here. So what are you talking about? Our lives have been ruined by war. So where do you get this idea that you're fighting something righteous when we're the ones suffering? I think for her, her voice was coming from, a point of being really frustrated and really angry that she had no control over the fact that her life was being destroyed and everything around her was being destroyed. Be it somehow there's this expectation that, because you're of a certain sect and you live in a certain area, you need to support the faction that's fighting for you. It's like, why don't you all just stop fighting? How about that? That nuance exists, and it exists today. I think now the kind of like microscope is now on the Shiite communities of South Lebanon who have borne the brunt of Israel's attacks since this current war started. They've been displaced, they're living in tents on the streets. They've had, Israel's demolishing their villages, these ancient historic villages, their homes are being, destroyed. And, I think we keep on talking about the Shia Muslims and Hezbollah as if they're, it's all homogenous and they're all thinking the same way. Yeah, there is definitely support for the resistance and resisting and fighting Israel, defending your land against attempted colonization and erasure. But of course, within these households, there's also like, okay, but we're also paying the price for this. We're losing everything. There is a space between being tribal in your thinking and for being loyal and also being totally opposed to that tribe. There is a space in between where people experiencing the consequences of war as they're happening are no doubt having conversations within their households that are questioning the approaches, that are questioning the methods, that are questioning decisions that are being made. The same would be said of the Palestinians in Gaza. I'm sure, a lot of them support Palestinian resistance by default because they're all refugees from being expelled in 1948 from their lands in actual Palestine, that's currently Israel. Of course, they support endeavours to kind of try and reclaim a bit of their land and a bit of their homes. But if you ask them, did you support what Hamas did 100% on October 7 that brought untold calamity to your personal life? Of course, there's going to be debates and discussions within those households about, we're the ones paying the price. So there's always nuance, and that nuance is never captured, neither by the journalism that's covered because they don't understand this, but also by history books and political books written by Western theorists and historians who don't have access to these households. And that's the difference that I think my book brings. I've lived in this stuff. There's an insight that people who are indigenous to the areas in which these issues are taking place and these stories are taking place, there's an insight that we bring that people from the outside who want to cover this stuff, even if they've spent for decades at university and writing papers on it, they just can't access it because they don't live it. They don't have the inside lens, so to speak. And so my book, it's an intention to demonstrate that, within these households, there are debates and discussions and they're fierce about what's going on around us because we're the ones paying the price. And we're always debating and discussing whether these are the methods that need to be pursued, whether these decisions are the right decisions, whether what we're doing is the right thing. That was the case for Mum in her family when the expectation was that Maronite Christians would support the right-wing militias in fighting the Palestinians and Lebanese Muslim and leftist factions in the Civil War in 75, 76, as there are right now in a lot of the communities who are suffering war and paying the price. Of course, there's nuanced conversations. That's what part of this book tries to show.
Something else I noticed about the people in the story, the people who find themselves in the midst of this conflict, is a recurring motif of hospitality. So there are these scenes where people are simply coming around to someone else's house to visit, or there are scenes where people are fleeing for their lives and seeking shelter. But anytime someone enters a building, after their well-being is accounted for, someone will inevitably offer them tea or coffee, tell them to sit down, even in the midst of this chaos, this depravity. And I feel you may have wanted to incorporate this to communicate something about dignity, the urge to preserve not only physical signifiers of culture, but the interpersonal aspects too. Is that right?
Dignity is everything. And if people want to understand our culture, the people of the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, actually all Arab and Islamic culture, dignity is absolutely everything. And that's why hospitality, it's ingrained in our way of operation. You can't escape that because dignity and honor kind of work hand in hand. And so your intention is that you want people to leave your home, saying positive things about you. Being like, oh, we went into their house, they served us coffee. If they don't serve you coffee, that's when everyone starts gossiping about you.
Yeah, but this persists even in the face of disintegration and war repeatedly.
We've been in wars non-stop for about a century. I'm talking about this from an Indigenous perspective. Since Western imperialism landed in our lands in 1914 with World War I and the collapse of the Ottomans, and the British with the Australians, and the French moved in and carved us all up, created this colonial outpost called Israel, armed it to the teeth to beat us all down. We have been in non-stop war. For me, that's 4 generations of family that have experienced all this stuff. I think every Palestinians obviously suffered most because they've actually been cleansed from their lands. I'd probably say also Lebanese society has been degraded to the point where most of us have left. Most Lebanese live outside the country. That's another form of cleansing. The Syrian tragedy on top of that with their huge diaspora now, the Iraqis with their invasion and their diaspora, it's just been non-stop war that's decimated our societies over and over and over again. But the resistance hasn't died. It hasn't folded. And I think when you study cases of colonialism, I think, maybe 100 years from now when someone does a whole kind of exercise on this and a whole study on this, they will note that for that entire century, our people kept on resisting and never folded. And a big part of that is because we are a culture that's steeped in dignity and we just can't tolerate our dignity being stripped away. And that's what the Israelis do. They try to crush the spirit of the Palestinian people. They try to crush the spirit of the Lebanese. That's why they do the mowing the lawn things that they've done. That's why they've demolished everything in Gaza. They're demolishing things down South Lebanon. They've slaughtered, they've massacred. They're trying to destroy the will and the spirit of the people. But a people whose very existence is steeped in dignity and dignified representation, they can't allow that to just be washed away and move on from it. And that's a big reason why the resistance has maintained and has stood firm. And even with Israel being armed to the teeth with the most sophisticated weaponry, not just now, there has been since they were created. The Lebanese and Palestinians had nothing. What, a bunch of rockets, a few stones? We have nothing to fight against them. We don't have anything to shoot their jets down from the skies. We don't have tanks. We have nothing to fight with except our dignity. Our dignity is our weapon. And that's why I think it's an incredible story. I haven't written it in this book, but it's one that needs to be told of why people have stayed steadfast. It's intertwined in our culture because we are a people of high dignity, and to be stripped of that, to have that desecrated the way it's been desecrated so many times and still to this day, it only empowers you to fight back.
This is true. And when you speak to this in the current context, but also how this is depicted in your book, it makes one recognize that when a transgressive or violent act desecrates someone's dignity, it is the person who commits this act who is ultimately undignified. It's a moral failing on the part of the desecrator, especially when one is defenseless.
As what the world has seen for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
It's all become apparent to everyone that Israel is not just a bully. I mean, it's beyond bullying what they've done. It is just horrific against the people that's defenseless. And yeah, you're right. It makes them look like the shameful ones for what they've done.
I'm getting the sense that the two of us could probably speak on this for many hours, but I would like to return to your book because there's plenty of other literature, stories and poetry out there that can speak to this to a far greater degree than I can.
Yes, of course.
So returning to your mother's story and of her eventual migration to Australia, which occupies about the final fifth of this book, there's this powerful idea that you point to, which is that when one migrates, one carries the past with you, but you also have to leave behind and begin again. There's this unique duality of existence for the migrant or the refugee, a rebirth of sorts, but one that is heavily conditioned. And I sense this is the rebirth that your book's title is referring to in one way. But I sense that there is more to this. So, in stepping outside of the narrative that you do present in this section, which I'll leave readers to uncover themselves, what is your own sense of your mother's life before and after?
Yeah, I got the part 2 of Mum's story, didn't I, living with her in Australia. I would say Mum, she always talks about her childhood in Lebanon as pretty much the happiest days of her life. I guess we have rose tinted windows when we look back on our past. All of us do, I suppose. I think the added layer of her nostalgia is that everything that she lived only exists in her memory. She can never access that again. She can never access the place. She can never access the people. That's the pain of migration, especially migration through war. Like, I've spent my adult years, I lived in Lebanon, I lived in the US, I lived in France, but I always came back to Melbourne, and Melbourne's kind of still the same. It's got a few more skyscrapers, but the place of my childhood hasn't really changed. I can always come back and access it. The people are still here. Mum lost everything. She lost people. She lost friends. She lost everything. The place, it's gone. She's had to wear that pain this entire time, and it's so hard. It's so hard. So on the one hand, she's carried that trauma, and that's been obviously visible to me from the get-go. I couldn't describe it or give it a diagnosis, but I could see there's something not right there. But then she's also, in terms of her way she's parented, she has thrown everything to her children. The rebirth is her children, because when you've lost everything that you've loved, you've got to find some other love to kind of hang on to give your life some purpose and meaning. And that's been her children. And that's been a very intense motherhood love. Like, she's very protective, very defensive. She was very affected by things that happen to her children in a very kind of personal way. She takes it very personally. Thinking the worst will happen to you. Part of my book is archiving history through the experiences of my family, what they endured. The Australian part of this history component is the migrants who came in the 70s and 80s, especially women, who worked in sweatshops, who worked in textile factories in Melbourne suburbs, where other migrant women came with similar stories, similar backgrounds from different parts of the world. That's the Australian component. And I think one thing I wanted to flesh out in this is that in all of our suburbs, there's so many women like my mum who are just sitting there quietly, who've come from different parts of the world, who've also suffered really traumatic events. And, because of patriarchy or other reasons, their stories are just not spoken. They're just sitting there with their traumas, and they manifest in different ways. That's the Australian leg of the story.
There's one final section of this book that I wanted to touch on, and that is the acknowledgements page. And I imagine that despite the best intentions and hopes of an author, this is a part of many books that exists just as a place for them, their publishing colleagues, and their significant friends and family members. But I wanted to draw attention to a passage from your acknowledgements page, because I think there's a depth and earnestness that I felt there, and I felt it was worth remarking upon. So if I may, I'd like to read a brief passage. It reads, "There is no greater depth in our capacity to love than to unveil the deepest scars etched in our hearts. As Khalil Gibran writes, love in its complete form encompasses both the peaks of our joy and the valleys of our sorrow. And it is our willingness to explore love to its fullest extent that makes living worthwhile. You sat through days of shared tears, gradually lifting the layers that, over the decades, shrouded the most severe wound inflicted upon your heart. In doing so, you shared your total love with your son, and in this journey we have walked together, have made my life worth living." How do you reflect upon this sentiment and the words of Khalil Gibran you chose?
For those who are familiar with that passage, it's from his book of poems, The Prophet, which was written a century ago. And I read that in my mid-30s. I'm 40 now. Kind of gravitated to the meaning that he was trying to get across, which is that the whole point of living is to experience love to its greatest extent, because that's the greatest gift that life can give you. The lesson for me, and what I try to remind myself, but also I think a lesson for others, and the reason why I wrote it in this way, and I finished the acknowledgements with that message, is because, our current modes of life, we kind of lose sight of the purpose of living. In this capitalist world that we're living in, very materialistic, very consumerist, and now with the cost of living crisis, we're in survival mode, right? We're surviving. But also in the way our societies are built, we don't have community the way we had community. We don't have family the way we had family, right? Everything is we're just skating on the surface of, I think, what it means to be human, why we're actually here, what's the point of our existence. And I think the problem with our modus operandi at the moment, as people living in a capitalist society like Australia, we're easily distracted in thinking and convinced that, the current modus operandi is our purpose. It is about going to work, getting a house, getting a mortgage, paying the rent, paying the bills, having children, making sure they're fed, getting by the daily pressures. But actually the purpose of life, what makes it worthwhile, what gives it meaning, you put that aside for a moment and you dive in and you explore where love can take you on every level. On every level. I'm not talking about love in the romantic Disney sense of finding someone, getting married, happy ever after. I'm not talking about that. And that's what this book shows. There is tragedy in my book, but there is love with that tragedy. And so that's what living is all about. And that was Khalil Gibran's message 100 years ago in his poems. It was, the whole point of our existence is to allow our hearts and our human senses to reach their extremes. And the extremes is the absolute depths, the crushing, grinding depths that love can take you. So it's a reminder to all of us that, we can't lose sight of this. We can't lose sight of what makes human existence worthwhile ever since we came into being, and what still makes it worthwhile, even if we are distracted by everything that capitalism is throwing at us. I think that's the reminder that I keep saying to myself. And it's kind of actually propelled me to kind of change my life. I was working the 9-to-5 jobs, participating in this materialistic consumerist lifestyle, being distracted by those things. But I always knew this story was hovering around. I always knew there was something deeper, lingering. And I decided to access it by writing this book. And because of that, it's kind of like reshaped how I approach the world. And it's very difficult when you're living in a society that is structured in the way that I've kind of just relayed. It's very capitalist, it's very surface level, it's very time consuming and pressure intensive. But I've tried to reshape it in a way that centers the things that make it worthwhile, which is people, community, and ultimately love. That sounds really cheesy, but if you read my book, I'm not talking about the Disney kind of love. I'm talking about the real, genuine, earth-shattering loves that make life worthwhile.
The unkind mind might say it's cheesy, but I completely agree. And I appreciate that you arrive at what is such a quite universally applicable philosophy through really reckoning with such a personal story. I think you've carried that story and done it justice, and I loved reading it. So thank you for sharing the story with us and for coming to join me in conversation on the podcast to discuss your book. And congrats on its publication.
I don't think this was a podcast session. I think it was a therapy session for me. So thank you for that.
Rebirth, a love story from the depths of war, is available via all reading stores and at our website. You'll find all kinds of other recommendations for all kinds of great books. We also have limited signed copies at our carton shop and online. While visiting our website, you can also sign up to e-news or to receive our free monthly newsletter, The Readings Monthly. The Readings podcast is produced by me, Nico Callaghan. Thank you for listening.